When the Consortia directors and the committee discussed the organization of the symposium, and we're coming to our final point here, we thought it would be very important to not finish the day without some sort of summary and thoughts and kind of a broad-scale reflection on the things that had been discussed and the things that had been presented during the day. And so we thought it would be appropriate to invite somebody who had a broad perspective to begin with and had wide experience to sit through the day, to listen to the speakers and panelists, to interact with them during the breaks, and then present some summary, some short summary comments, and some reflection on exactly what the Anthropocene might be. After a lot of looking around, it was clear to us that the perfect candidate was Senator Tim Wirth. He has experience both as the president of the United Nations Foundation and the Better World. He has experience both with social issues in terms of education, the environment, health, as a past representative to the Congress from Colorado and then a senator from Colorado, working on the Hill with colleagues there, working in a number of past administrations in the government. He seems to have a very broad and we think wise perspective on the country and the world and these issues. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Senator Wirth to come and give us a few minutes of his thoughts about what he heard today on the Anthropocene.
Well, if I were really wise, I would have said no to this invitation after this extraordinarily rich day. John, thanks to you and your colleagues. I mean, it really has been an extraordinary day, and I think all of the people left in the audience, would join me in thanking you and everybody at the Smithsonian for doing such a great job. So thanks ever so much. I'm especially pleased to have been able to start the day with Charles Mann. I don't know how many of you actually read 1491 or 1493 or both. I would recommend it not only to you, it was thrilling to me, but also to read 1493 and then to get it on DVD and listen to it in your car. My wife and I are going through our third time through. It's so rich and so wonderful, and it really makes you think about all kinds of things. So the panels were all great, but hearing the great man was even a better part for me for the day, so thank you especially for that. One single note and then a suggestion. You'll know, except for a brief comment, and maybe I missed it, a brief comment in the first panel, there was no discussion today at all about demography, population issues. I mean, it was like almost every single forum one goes to in this day and age. Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody feels comfortable talking about population, but if it's, whatever's looming right there, it is the fact that we're now 7 billion people. We're moving rapidly into a much, much larger population. The largest childbearing cadre in the history of the Earth is on Earth right now, and the decisions that they make about the size of their families and the spacing of their children is going to determine whether we go to 8.5 or 10 or 12 billion people. And that in turn is going to have as much or more influence about everything that we have talked about all day long. So I just wanted to add that piece to it and hope that the next time there's a gathering, get somebody in or ask them or charge them or whatever to inject this and sort of make people talk about it. Anyway, I think about today's event, and rather than making specific comments, I'm struck by the flavor and the tone of the last panel, particularly the last 15 minutes, in which there was a sense that is shared. I travel a great deal and have just come back from 15 days of not sleeping in the same bed every night. I was talking to lots of foundation people, lots of community groups, lots of leadership groups, and everywhere the sense that we are in some very, very dire circumstance in the United States of America comes up in one language or another, one way of saying it or another. People are really worried about where we are going, more than I have ever seen this. before we've had sort of episodic ups and downs. This is a very deep set of concerns about the issues raised in equity. What was Occupy all about? What's the rich-poor all about? You know, why is the sharing seem to be so little part of our social contract today? What's going on in terms of privatization? We used to be proud of public schools and public libraries and public transportation, and now we're increasingly a country of gated communities. You know, how are we thinking about higher education or education and science overall if we're unwilling to invest in the future? My state of Colorado, which used to be a real bellwether of achievement and excellence, is now 50th in the country behind Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana in terms of participation of the public in the education of our young. It is simply staggering. It is such a terrible condition, and the slide goes down. I don't have to note for all of you the incapacity of our Congress to make any kind of a decision about anything, even something as simple as funding infrastructure, which you would think would be something that everybody would agree upon: potholes, bridges, highways, and airports. Even that, you know, we cannot decide on. So there's a real sense of concern out across the country. And what are we going to do about it? It's going to come back to this. I'm going to bring it right back to here. What are we going to do about this? I think if we look at the history of the country, the kind of change that's going to be necessary does not come from the top down. It does not come because there are a handful of extraordinarily wise people high above the silent city making decisions about where the country ought to go. If you think about what's happened in the lifetime of many of us in this room, the major changes in the country, the civil rights movement, the consumer movement, the environmental movement, the women's movement, none of those came because there were decisions made in Washington about that was the way to go. It came because of the determination and organization of people at the grassroots. Community organizations. What we are most proud of in the country is this remarkable civil society which we still have in the country. There are still this sense of organization, and this sense of our common sharing goals and democracy is still out there across the country. Now, how do we translate that resource which we still have in the country to dealing with these problems of our democratic society and our ability to make decisions about our own future? What's the linkage between those two? That is something that I've been talking to a lot of foundations about, been talking about a lot of others about. You know, how do we begin, how do we mark a kind of dialogue about our common future? How do we get this coming from the bottom to come up? How do we manage this? We're a huge society of 300 million people, enormously diverse, and the country is mammoth. I mean, it is just a mammoth place. How do we manage that? How do we use the new tools of technology that are going to help us to tie all of this together? I don't think we know yet, but I think we have to begin this quest, and I think we have to begin this soon after Election Day, and I think we have to begin this all across the country. And this is a discussions among citizens about what they see and what they think is wrong and what they think can be done about it. And I think there's a responsibility among all of the lead institutions as well, and that brings me right back here. The discussion that we had today, you know, was incredibly interesting, and it was a wonderful kind of bath of great science and great thinking and great ideas. But it was very much, in a way, in a cocoon. You know, it was in a cocoon of sort of, you know, isolation from a lot of, at least that was my feeling, a lot of who's getting dirt under their fingernails, who's really kind of getting things done and trying to move the ball, you know, and how do we go about doing that? You know, what I'd do if I were the Secretary of the Smithsonian, what I would do, John, if I were you and your colleagues thinking about where we go from here, I'd say, well, maybe what came out of this was a set of problems, and we ought to begin to create a Smithsonian forum. And there are a series of ideas, there are a series of issues that came up today, you know, that could well be addressed by the Smithsonian, using your unique convening capability. You are a national voice and a national institution. You can draw people in from many places, and you can have the deliberations that occur here, transmitted out across the country. You could do that with I think, with a pretty aggressive program. For example, if you begin with what we just talked about here, sustainable economics. Start with a program. The economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. Put that out as an issue, and what does that mean, and what's happening with the future of our economy? How do we talk about climate information? The IPCC is coming out with its new report in 15 or 18 months. What's the responsibility to bring citizens into what that is, and to begin to get that information out to people, and what does that mean to 300 million Americans? The new demography. We're at a time not only of a rapidly growing population, but an aging population and an urbanizing population, and a population of immigration all over the world. What do those issues mean to Americans? It is a hot button issue. How do we talk about that issue, in a way that this institution can contribute? Income and democracy. I could go through a list of ideas, but it seems to me that, there's a forum here that the Smithsonian ought to be carrying forward for the health of our democracy. What is our common future, and what is the Smithsonian's contribution to that? Finally, I bet you can get almost anybody to come, and to be the feature of this kind of a program. Say you have, a program every month for 6 months, something like that. And you get a major speaker to start the day off at 9 o'clock in the morning. Bill Clinton will come if you ask him the right things. He is extraordinary. We had a dinner last, I don't mean to brag, I've been traveling a lot, but we had a dinner last week. And he was concerned, just as an aside, the thing that had concerned him was the story that day in the New York Times about life expectancy in the United States. I don't know if many of you saw that. That it had gone down dramatically. The bottom quarter of the white population in the country, male life expectancy had decreased by 4 years. Female life expectancy had decreased by 7 years in the last 20 years. It was Russian. What you sort of think about happened in the 50s or 60s in the old Soviet Union. It was an extraordinary story. And the story said that this was because of obesity, probably obesity, smoking, and abuse of pharmaceuticals. Clinton said, I think that's right, but I'll tell you what I really think it was. He said, I think it's people dying of a broken heart. Whoa. I just sort of stopped the conversation. And then you start to think about what has happened to the expectations that people in this democratic society have for themselves and their children and the future of the country. That was a remarkable point, I thought. And it began a discussion in a completely different way. Ask Bill Clinton, and I bet you he'd come. Ask Warren Buffett to come and talk about equity. Nobody does it more beautifully than he does. He is just a fabulous human being and wonderfully thoughtful. And how do we get him into a broad public forum? The Smithsonian could help to do that and help to get America to talk about that issue of equity which lies underneath so many things. Get Bill O'Reilly to come and talk about climate change. Bill O'Reilly is a climate believer. I've been on the O'Reilly show twice on climate change. He believes in climate change, believes that we ought to act on it. Obviously his sponsors and his viewership and so on are quite in the same place that he is, but ask him to come. If you don't ask, he has an absolute chance of not coming. My guess is that, he's probably never been asked. And asked him to come and talk about climate, for example. These are just examples. Find Jim Kim. Jim Kim is the new head of the World Bank. Ask him to come. The other day, we had a session, opening session, where he was kind of talking about what he wanted to do with the bank. And it was wonderful to hear a public health doctor talk about a banking institution, be running a bank. Really refreshing and wonderfully interesting. What's the culture of the bank like, and how do you change it, and where do you want to go with it? He began the discussion with an impassioned plea that the foundation sitting around the table, there were about 8 of us, focus key resources on the climate issue. which is great. He ended the discussion an hour and a half later saying, let me just close by this. He said something close to, we're going to be measured by how we do on climate change. And that's a measure of how much we love our children and grandchildren. Now, these are the, I think, these are the kind of people and the kinds of ideas that you can bring here, John. I think that you have an obligation also to do this. The country is in great need, grave need, and the Smithsonian has a major opportunity and a major obligation to join, I think, this discussion and this battle. And boy, it would be a lot of fun, too, to set that sort of thing up. Finally, will the Congress go along with that? Like raising a lot of these issues? Well, you can go out and find probably some private funding to help you do this, so you get yourself a little bit insulated. But then we go ahead and say, hey, this is an institution to talk about science and society. That's the wonderful part of the Smithsonian. So we saw a window of that today. You know, what kind of excellence could be here. So kind of a remarkable group of people that came today. I love some of the ideas. What is the idea of the sort of radical solutions that Rick talked about this morning? I mean, there are a lot of those things we have to get in there. Loved your thoughts about sort of the literature and the gap between rich and poor and how we think about that. I mean, there were some great people here today with some wonderful visions about the world and weave them into this. But that's my closing thought, and I think, you know, it'd be interesting, I don't know, John, if you have time, everybody's very tired at the end of a long and very productive day, but maybe, I don't know if anybody has any reactions to what they think, if any members of the audience have any thoughts about, you know, where they might like to go from here. So, but let me stop at that.